Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a rare pre-recorded show that one day I'll explain the reasons behind it. But anyway, joining me today is award-winning master's degree student Alicia Callahan. She is here to talk about the bond shared by the men of the 6th Armored Division, especially in the Battle of the Bulge, but also through their entirety of combat in Europe. So I'll bring her in now. Good morning where you are. How are you today?
Good. I'm so good. How are you today, Paul?
I'm very well. So, the 6th Armored Division, one of the divisions probably that gets a little bit less attention than some of the others. I mean, the men who served in it would not agree, but how did you decide to focus on that particular division or that unit?
I gotta say, I think my entire experience in the historical world has been that of fate. So I became a history major my sophomore year of college and undergrad. And I really just fell in love with World War II history and all of that. And it wasn't until I became a history major, so this all happened after the fact, that I found a diary of my great uncle's father that no one had ever seen before, just recounting in great detail his experiences in World War II. And that's when I realized he was in the 6th Armored Division, the 128th, and I just really wanted to focus on his story and share the entire division's experiences.
Brilliant. And one of the things we often talk about on this channel is that it's sometimes 2 or 3 generations on that are doing the work to bring things to light, because we were just talking about it a few days ago. The veterans themselves tended to not talk about it at all. Their children may have been interested in the subject, but they aren't necessarily the generation that scanned documents, looked at archives, and it's now kind of the grandchildren, in some cases the great-grandchildren, who are doing that work, where it's just normal to, when you find a document, to scan it, take a photo of it, enlarge it, look at it, and then, search online for documentation and archives. And I think that's the revolution we're facing, is that as the veterans have pretty much all passed away, there's a handful left that we're treasuring, but we're pretty much moving to that era when they are no longer with us. It is going to be people like yourself who are bringing in all these resources together, where it would be completely natural for you to, when you're looking for a place to go online and look at Google Earth, go down Street View, all those kind of things, and giving us a much more 360-degree understanding of its history than perhaps people 40 and 50 years ago did. Indeed, when I started out, which wasn't quite 40 or 50 years ago, but actually not that far away. But anyway, you've come armed with a PowerPoint, and we will kind of hand over to you to take us through that. And folks, if you want to leave comments about this video after the event, we will try and come and address them later on. I'll send the link out so that we can try and respond to them. But basically, I'll hand over now to my guest to take us through this fascinating story.
Beautiful. All right. So I am so excited to share the story of the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division with y'all. So as I was doing my research, I didn't want to focus solely on their experiences in battle. I just think that is a small chapter of their entire lives. So I really followed these Super Sixers, which was their nickname, from their childhoods to their experiences as veterans as well. But a little background of the Super Sixth: they were officially activated on February 15th, 1942 in Kentucky. And before they went over to Europe, they trained at Camp Cook, California. And they fought in the European theater of World War II. They landed on the beaches of Normandy 42 days post D-Day, fought through 9 months of continuous frontline combat through the Battle of the Bulge that eventually led them to liberate Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11th, 1945. So once again, as I was saying earlier, Thomas Hackler's diary is actually what inspired my research of the 6th Armored Division. And through reading his very harrowing story that we will get into further, I realized that oftentimes military history conglomerates entire divisions or units into one single body, but it really was the overall accomplishments of each and every soldier that allowed the Allies to win World War II. And I just think that is so often forgotten. And so a really big mission of my research was to give names to the division and of those soldiers who really did earn the nickname Super Sixth.
I'm just going to interrupt you right away, because I love the fact of this approach, because I think when it comes to armored divisions, everybody's focus is always the vehicles. It's always the tanks, the half tracks. We don't do that with infantry divisions, because we understand that infantry divisions are primarily human beings. But I think with armored divisions, sometimes people get too caught up on so what vehicles do they have? When did they change the M4A3? And actually, it's people as well. The tools are only as good as the people operating them. So thank you for that focus.
Absolutely. And we will go so much further into that, especially when going over the Battle of the Bulge, that the men in these tanks, although they were inside these giant pieces of metal, it was very real for them as well. And of course, my research was inspired by Alex Kershaw's work in The Liberator, a very similar, incredible story about the personalized experiences of war that also resulted in the liberation of Dachau. So the way I wanted to go about this research is I knew I really needed to use all my resources. So I did what I thought was best, and I went onto the 6th Armored Division Facebook page, which I wasn't sure how it would work out. The response was overwhelming, as children and grandchildren of the 6th Armored Division were so open with sharing memories and memorabilia that had never previously been seen outside of their own family. It was absolutely incredible. And I was able to uncover so much through what was shared with the descendants of these soldiers. And then, in order to mesh the stories of the division's history, I extensively referred to the writing Combat History of the 6th Armored Division. This was written by the soldiers in a very matter-of-fact tone in 1946. So combining these two archives, I was able to really create a comprehensive breadth of war and social history, which is really what I was going for. And I couldn't have done it without the descendants.
Brilliant.
Thank you. And then for arguments, this thesis was supposed to be about 30 pages. It ended up being 80 because I was trying to work so much into it. I didn't want to leave anything out. So basically, lots of arguments throughout my research. The first one being that each soldier sewed together new experiences of trauma and brotherhood through the Second World War to form an untold chapter of their lives, as we were talking about earlier. They really didn't talk about this. Moreover, while in service, the 6th Armored Division's confidence and camaraderie was simultaneously rivaled by the frontline effects of attrition, exhaustion, and stress. Confidence and camaraderie simultaneously grew until the Battle of the Bulge, and here that the soldier performance was graphically exhibited in a bell curve. And once they hit the Battle of the Bulge, they reached their peak, and truly no amount of confidence could offset the effects of this continuous frontline combat. And as a result, brotherhood and battle fatigue ultimately culminated in the liberation of Buchenwald. Okay, so just starting off way in the back, this is a beautiful picture of Super Sixer William Lumen holding a .22 in 1922. And all of these men shared rural and difficult childhood experiences. This was, however, intentional by the United States Army. When the United States Army was creating these armored divisions, they intentionally sought out these quote-unquote farm boys since they assumed they would be familiar with operating the double clutch, which was required to operate the Sherman tank. But an unexpected effect of getting these farm boys, and I grew up on the farm myself, I can vouch for this, is that these men had instincts and abilities that no training could ever teach them. Just growing up in the middle of nowhere, Thomas Hackler says that the shooting part of training was always so easy for him because he grew up hunting for his food in the foothills of Missouri, but the math was always so difficult for him. So these men really were prepared for war in every way possible. And then once again, after the war, jumping so far ahead, these interwoven stories is that these men never really discussed their horrific war experiences, but they would, however, from time to time, share their comedic stories, which I'm very excited to share as we get into the soldiers. Okay, so starting right off, the men began their 10-month stay at Camp Cook, and this left so much time for training, entertainment, and anxiety. Here's a picture of William Lumen boxing with a fellow soldier at Camp Cook. William Lumen discusses boxing and watching movies extensively in his letters home to his wife, Viola. But during this time, also, friendship and brotherhood really began growing while in training. A lot of these men came from the country in the Midwest, and in one of the letters William Lumen wrote to his wife in March of 1943, William said, "Some of the fellows went down to the beach today, and you should have heard them talk about it when they came back. You see, they came from the Midwest and have never seen an ocean in their life." Here we just really see the beginning of these men are experiencing life in a way that it's really hard for us today to even understand. We go on trips to see the beach, we go do all these things. They really didn't do that. They didn't leave their homes very often. So they really began to lean on each other and bond with each other as they experienced these new aspects of life. Also during Camp Cook, these soldiers had much time for boredom. And poor Steve Neofatistos understood this better than most. When I was speaking to his daughter, Sheila, she never really understood why her father had an absurd fear of snakes, even though he grew up working on the farm and became a farmer when he returned home from war as well. Turns out, while at Camp Cook, to keep each other alert during long training exercises, the soldiers would throw snakes into each other's foxholes. And because of this and the amount of times that it happened to Steve, he was absolutely terrified of snakes for the rest of his life, all because of this way to keep each other awake at Camp Cook. And here we have Thomas Hackler. It's not the best picture, but there weren't many of him. So Thomas writes in his diary that at this point, they were just choking on sand with every breath they took. It was so windy. The days were so hot. The nights were so cold. And bugs became their bedfellows. So Thomas Hackler recounts that during this time at Camp Cook, this is when the United States Army really began to treat the suffering of the soldiers with alcohol and beer at the end of the day. And Thomas says this is really what started him on his life of struggling with alcohol, because he really learned that the only way to cope with this pain was through the beer that was provided. And then finally, on January 25th, 1944, the Super Sixers make their way to New York. And on February 10th, 1944, they began their 12-day voyage to Scotland. Thomas Hackler recounts that he was so grateful that he didn't join the Navy, as he was throwing up over the ship the entire time they were headed over there. And then finally, the Super Sixers traveled by train to England, where, like the rest of the world, they anxiously awaited the D-Day invasions for 4 months. And while waiting, homesickness grew exponentially among the soldiers as they adjusted to both the new landscape and the culture. And I really want to direct your attention to the picture that is above. And that picture is the Super Sixers enjoying high tea in England.
Oh, how lovely. High tea. Not to be confused with tea. We did a show a few days ago about the difference between tea and high tea. And sometimes tea is the meal, sometimes tea is the drink. But high tea is with cakes and biscuits. And yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I honestly didn't even know that. So thank you. But truly, just imagining these men, they grew up on the farm working, and they were depression kids, but here they are having high tea in England. Like, they really had to lean on one another as they really started to understand how far away they were from their loved ones. And as I mentioned before, they, like everyone else, did not know when the D-Day invasions were happening. So it was an extreme feeling of anxiousness for them as well. So it was definitely a time that brotherhood began to grow even more. However, finally, on July 18th, 1944, over a month past D-Day, the Super Sixers began their first campaign, the Brittany campaign. So they landed on the beaches of Normandy, and their main goal of this campaign was to drive up the Brittany Peninsula, which is pictured there, because they needed the ports to offload supplies in France. During this time, the 6th Armored Division really intentionally tried to bypass the German army, and they were quite successful in this because they were just trying to get comfortable operating on European soil. However, when they did run into the Germans, the element of surprise often protected the soldier. And
just to quickly jump in, because I do that sometimes. One of the things that we don't discuss enough is the many units that are sitting in England for, in this case, 6 weeks after D-Day without being committed, because obviously not everybody can go first, and there's eventually 1.5 million Allied soldiers come through Normandy, but some don't come ashore till November. People forget that there's a massive great tail that's still coming ashore. Is there anything in the letters and things you read about any kind of sense of frustration that they weren't able to get involved sooner, or what are we doing here, just waiting around because they're not really training very much, because obviously England didn't have as much space for maneuvers and things? Is there anything in there about that sense of any frustration?
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I'm so glad you brought this up. This is perfect. One of the most powerful letters I read from William Luman, his son Bill sent me an entire collection of his letters, was in reference to the waiting game that he had to experience. If you don't mind, I just pulled it up. I would really love to read you one of the paragraphs he sent.
Please do.
It was incredible. So he starts by telling his wife about all this waiting, and he doesn't understand why they're waiting for so long. And he talks about how much he misses going through the new homes for sale in the newspaper with his wife. And then he goes on to say, quote, "The sweetheart, it's those little plans of ours and millions of other young couples like us that are going to win this war. We really have something to fight for, and we just won't be beaten. As I have often told you before, those plans of ours will be carried out if it's the last thing I do. But first, we have to show those madmen and their followers that our way of life and our beliefs may not fit in with their plan of new order, but it's what we want and what we will fight for. If we can't persuade them with discussions or speeches, then we will pound it into them in such a way that the last war will seem like a tea party alongside what they get this time." And then this is truly the part of them waiting. "I came into the army with the belief that I wouldn't want to hurt anyone unless in self-defense, and that it wasn't their fault that they were fighting us, but that they were forced to. Well, hun, my ideas have changed a lot. If he believes he's fighting for the right thing, I don't agree with him. No foolin', hun. The longer I sit around here and think about all the time I'm wasting, the madder I get. Maybe that's why they are keeping us here, waiting for us to get fighting mad before we get a whack at the enemy. If they are, they had better let us go soon. Most of us are just about ready to sail over now. Just remember, darling, that I love you and only you, and that something I have to fight for is you and everything you stand for." End quote.
Wow.
I know that's a very long passage, but when I first read that, I started bawling, like goosebumps over my entire body. I just thought it was incredible.
Yeah, and another thing to consider from my English perspective as well is that the civilians in the UK started to wonder when these guys that were around them were also going to go into combat, because if you're a Londoner and your husband is already fighting in Normandy, and you're seeing American, British, Polish, Czech units marching up and down your village streets, you're thinking, why aren't these guys going to go there? So the guys who hadn't been committed are frustrated they haven't gone. There can also be a little bit of misunderstood resentment from the civilians saying, when are those guys going to get over there? Because some of the people in Britain have been seeing units passing them for 4 years. We understand as historians, as I said earlier, they can't all go in the same week. That is the system. It's the Allies have big war. They have the ability to bring divisions in and keep on feeding them into the system. But I can understand at the time it's frustrating for everybody concerned.
Absolutely, yeah. And I had never even considered that until I was reading through William's letters, and I just thought it was so powerful. They were ready to get into, they wanted to start so they could get home to their families as soon as possible. And I just feel like that's so forgotten.
No, definitely. And also just the difficulty of honing men to a point is that you can't keep people on red alert for weeks on end. You've kind of focus them, get them ready to go, and then kind of unleash them. You can't just keep people on tenterhooks for weeks on end saying, well, you're going to go at some point, but it's not today, it's not tomorrow, but just keep ready. It's very, very frustrating for people to be involved in that situation. You've got to kind of have downtime. And again, I think those watching us, we don't talk enough about those that are having to wait. We talk about the stresses of those who are going first, which of course are understandable. They're the ones storming the beaches, storming the Atlantic Wall, but it can be just as frustrating sitting there waiting and knowing that your turn is coming, but you don't know when. But so thanks for dealing with that. And then I'll let you get back to your fab presentation.
Okay, so once the moments of waiting were finally over for these soldiers and they really got comfortable operating on the European soil, I was just going into when they did accidentally run into the German army, the element of surprise really protected the Super Sixers. And one soldier who knows that better than most is Milton J. Murray. His story is one of my favorites. He was operating a train car, and one day while in France, he was operating a train car with lots of equipment and not very many men on board. And it's important to note, his daughter was telling me that this entire story, every story that Milton talked about after the war started with, we were lost. He had no idea where he was most of the time. And while he was in France, Milton J. Murray was supposed to go to one village, but he went to one that sounded exactly the same to him, and they were incredibly close together. I'm still trying to find that village. We will figure it out eventually. But when he drove up to the incorrect French village, he had this giant train car, and once again, there weren't very many men on board. However, he accidentally liberated this French village because the German soldiers that were in this town thought that it was filled with American soldiers. So they fled, and Milton J. Murray and the few men he was with stayed and got drunk on cider and food and were just having a great time until they realized they were in the wrong place and they had to run. But that was, once again, the moment where surprise really helped them, and then they accidentally liberated a village. And Milton's daughter, Dorothy, says it's one of her favorite stories just because it's so funny to her how that happens. And then also just kind of taking a jump back, I had the absolute honor of going to Normandy for the 79th anniversary of D-Day this year with the Best Defense Foundation. And here I am with Super Sixer Andy Negra, who is in the 128th Field Artillery Battalion. And he was telling me, as we stood on the beaches where they landed, he was telling me how, at least for him himself, he really wasn't scared as he landed on the beaches to begin the Brittany campaign because he didn't really know what to expect. But this was one of the most powerful moments of my life, just standing here and getting to hear his story and his experiences starting off the Brittany campaign. Okay. And then once the Brittany campaign was successfully ended, the Super Sixers began the Saar River campaign. And for this campaign, the goal was to help the American drive towards Germany while also protecting the land that they had previously captured. And during this time, new tactics were created and confidence grew among the soldiers. This is when they really started having close interactions with the German army and getting comfortable working together in close coordinated groups. It was incredible. So they would use this close coordination to defeat these heavily fortified towns and the riverine terrain that really often favored the German defensive positions. So, but during this campaign, constant Luftwaffe raids began that seldom ceased for the remainder of the war. The German Air Force caused, I should probably say Luftwaffe German Air Force for those who are not sure. But the German Air Force caused Tomek Hackler to sustain a back injury when an oven he was carrying was dropped by a comrade during a Luftwaffe raid. He was not granted the recovery time required and lived in excruciating pain for the rest of his life. And that's just carries very many examples of them working together, them really getting comfortable with each other, the Luftwaffe raids that seldom ceased for the remainder of the war, and especially the struggles of getting injured in war and having to fight through that. So Thomas Hackler, his back hurt him for the rest of his life, and that is one of the things he had to self-medicate with alcohol for the remainder of it. And then, however, also during the Saar River campaign, soldiers like Rush Wallace were able to demonstrate their ingenuity and how it saved their lives. So Rush Wallace, unsolicited without anyone telling him to, he would often go to the cooks of the division and ask for the used salt and sugar bags that would often be thrown away. And he would fill them with sand and just line the bottom of his Jeep with them. And no one told him to do this. It's just one of those things. Farm boys, they just do it without thinking. And one day he wasn't in his Jeep, but he was told that someone was going to be using it. And they took out his Jeep and hit a landmine. But because of the sand that Rush put in the bottom of the Jeep, both men survived. And in the Jeep, one of the soldiers was named Clarence Kelly. And he actually just passed away, but because of Rush, he lived to be 102 years old.
Wow.
Which I just think is absolutely incredible. He just passed away a couple weeks ago, but amazing. And then moving on, so the Saar River campaign was very successful. The soldiers then began the Saar River campaign from November 8th to December 24th. I'm sure we can figure out where the Saar River campaign is going to lead us. So during the Saar River campaign, the Super Six was trying to drive east from Nancy, France, and across the Saar River into Germany. At this point, the soldiers were incredibly confident. They had learned to work together effectively. However, during this time, because of how effectively they were working, they were being met with increasing enemy fire. And Wallace Wilmer Hughes knows better than most the effects of this enemy fire when they were trying to cross the French Need River. So here we have Wallace Wilmer Hughes. This is him in a wheelchair, actually, because when they were crossing the French Need River, Wallace's team was the first to cross. And his tank was hit with a German bazooka. And this is where we really go into, they were inside these tanks, but they still suffered significant casualties. And luckily, Wallace survived the interaction, but he did live the rest of his life missing a kneecap and multiple fingers. And it was quite funny. His daughter was telling me he went on to be a farmer. He would just be talking to his friends and would whip out his pocket knife and just pop out a piece of shrapnel from his body into his later years of life. Just didn't say anything about it. Very casual for them. But definitely explains that these soldiers were tough. And then, unfortunately, the campaign was cut short by the Ardennes campaign that is significantly characterized by the Battle of the Bulge. So as I was saying, the Saar campaign was cut short as the Super Six were sent to fight in the Battle of the Bulge to defend the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The Bulge characterized the Ardennes campaign as the men began their degradation of performance, which we are really going to get into. While defending this shoulder, the biting winter weather and constant enemy artillery pushed the soldiers far beyond their limits. And it's important to note that this bell curve I referred to earlier about performance slowly going down after it reaches its peak, that was a study done by the United States Army. So at this point in time, the bell curve really began to go down as these men were pushed far beyond their limits. Nonetheless, the soldiers demonstrated their ingenuity once more as they used grenades, blowtorches, and the occasional urination to thaw their machinery and equipment. Just going on, here we have Andy Giambrone, and he's the one that really referenced thawing their weapons using grenades, blowtorches, and the urine. And it's important to note that there were so many casualties from the weather as much as there were from the German offensive and the casualties of that. 55% of all cases of frostbite and trench foot in the Second World War came from the Battle of the Bulge. Any veteran you talk to that fought in the Bulge, talk about this weather. They reference cuddling or sleeping together in holes and using cow manure to keep warm. It was just an experience unlike any other. And during this time, Andy Giambrone stated in his book, it's called Odor of War, it's incredible, that the Second World War was truly won through the soldiers' ability to improvise. And few improvise better than these farm boys that I speak very fondly of.
Well, you clearly do. And just to jump in, I wonder whether there's any impact of the fact that the 6th Armoured, because they arrive in Normandy a few weeks in, and they haven't been in North Africa, they've experienced mostly everything going kind of to plan. They're feeling that they're part of the big mechanized Allied army. The air power is on their side. The artillery is on their side. It's all, of course, there's adversity. Of course, there's problems, but everything goes quite well. But the Battle of the Bulge is against the flow. It is the Germans launching what we call their last offensive. There are others in Hungary and other areas, but it was their last one that we Americans and Brits talk about. And so it kind of must have derailed them in terms of it being very unexpected. Unexpected, the attack in the first place, and unexpected that the response was. It took a while for the Allies to kind of get to the rhythm of what was happening. Would you think that would therefore that the shock for them was perhaps greater than if it was a unit that already experienced some adversity?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, for lack of a better term, I think it really changed everything that they thought they understood about war. Because as you were saying, that's something I really go into in my thesis. There were issues going in, but at this point, they really hadn't understood the traumas of war. One of the Super Sixers, his name is Gus Caceres, he talks about during the Battle of the Bulge, this was such a hard time for him because he was an infantryman, that he really learned that because of this weather, there was so much mud in the Bulge and the tanks couldn't get through. So that's when he really figured out his place in the food chain of sorts, that when the tanks couldn't get through, they would send in a soldier. And he said that a new infantryman was $10,000, but a new tank was $80,000, and they chose to forego the infantrymen instead of the tanks. And so I think that was a lot. It was a very difficult mentally for a lot of these soldiers because they really understood that the equipment, they felt that the equipment was more important than them, I think is important to note. And so very different experience from what they had endured beforehand. It's especially difficult when you think about during the Battle of the Bulge. They had the 75 millimeter direct fire cannon. And during the Bulge, they did move up to the 90 millimeter. But before that, they had less effective equipment compared to the Germans. The Germans put all of their efforts into the Battle of the Bulge. So it was just very different fighting ground for everyone involved, I would say. So Andy Giambroni really talks about that the soldiers were able to win World War II through their ability to improvise. And during this time, soldiers absolutely began to fear for their lives as well. Like we were just talking about, it was a very different experience at the Battle of the Bulge. Here we have a letter from Lieutenant Rush Wallace to his wife, Margaret. And this almost, if you read it, it almost seems like a goodbye message from him. He talks about, you've been a wonderful wife. And he talks about his children and how much he loves them. It's just really him saying goodbye to his family in a sort of way. And that's another thing that was really difficult for their minds was up until this point, a lot of them really hadn't had to consider death as strongly as they did now. And these letters really prove that. And it was just incredible to be able to read this letter.
Mm.
And then going back into the Ardennes campaign, like I said, these soldiers were really pushed beyond their limits. They were outnumbered by the German army in both soldiers and weaponry. And the combination of fatigue, sleep deprivation, and relentless combat began to decrease mental and physical ability. So here we have William Lumen. He's the one on the left. His story is heartbreaking. So back in December of 1944, he was sent into a hospital for mental effects of war, as they called it, battle fatigue. And he was sent back into battle in January, which happened to be one of the bloodiest days of the Battle of the Bulge. And he was still not mentally sound to be back there. And they found him hiding in the basement of a church, just unresponsive. Because he was suffering so badly from PTSD in that moment. And he was not just one experience of these men really hitting their breaking point. On the top right, we have Joseph Howard Hoot Marriott, who was shot out of his tank. And he had been shot out of 2 tanks and crawled right into his third. But he really suffered with PTSD for the rest of his life as a result. His niece remembers she came home from a date years later, and Joseph Howard heard a man on their doorstep and came out with a shotgun ready to kill him because he was just so on the defensive for the rest of his life. And on the bottom right, we have Dr. Robert Leffler. He did not suffer from battle fatigue himself, but one of his fellow surgeons did. So he is remembered by climbing into enemy fire and crawling through it to relieve another surgeon who was suffering from the effects of battle fatigue, or PTSD as we would call it now.
Yeah.
Were unbelievably pushed beyond their limits. Thomas Hackler recalls feeling like the Walking Dead as they went through this. It was just impossible to understand for a lot of them.
I'm so glad you raised this, because we had Mary Louise Roberts on maybe even a year or two ago now, talking about that winter of 44, 45, based on her book Sheer Misery. And I think a lot of people have forgotten, as you said earlier, it's an epidemic in terms of trench foot. It's desertions are through the roof in American, Canadian, British armies, because everybody's they're kind of fed up. The end is in sight. The end had been in sight, and the Battle of the Bulge throws that curveball there. So suddenly now, oh my God, how is this going to go on for? Then the weather is the worst, arguably, of the 20th century. And into all of this, you've got the mental fatigue, the stress, and this. It seems when you talked about the bond that these guys had shared, it had formed not accidentally. It formed out of their experiences as childhood, but no one had really given any consideration to maybe it wasn't quite as strong as it would without reinforcement. It's they're fine, and everybody's thinking they're fine, and then when, as you said, they're now facing adversity, because it had formed itself, there wasn't necessarily the support for it once it started falling apart. I can't quite articulate what I'm trying to say, but I know what I mean. Does that make any sense to you?
I do too. I could not agree more. Yeah, this was definitely the most difficult experience for them leading up to liberating Buchenwald concentration camp. So eventually the 6th Armored Division is very successful in defending the shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge. And once again, with no break whatsoever, the soldiers begin the Dadsberg-Prum campaign on January 27th, 1945. It's important to note that this campaign was very important for the soldiers as they were really trying to begin their push through Germany. And on February 7th, 1945, the 128th Field Artillery Battalion, which was Thomas Hackler's battalion of the 6th Armored Division, entered Germany and are believed to be the first Americans to have fired into Germany during World War II. And they really began their push through Germany's Siegfried Line, and they were really effective in the way that they worked together. Although they had began their degradation of battle performance, their intellect and their brotherhood and camaraderie and trust in one another really helped them begin ferociously pushing through this line. And then finally, from March 4th to the 8th, the Super Sixers got a short break to perform maintenance on their overworked tanks and half-tracks. Finally, the time came for them. However, they only had a very short 4-day break as the soldiers began their Germany campaign. And there's a moment from the Germany campaign I'd really like to touch on. So this started in March 8th. And on March 15th, the division was trying to secure a bridgehead on the Rhine. And I'm going to completely botch the name. It's called Côte de Delme. It's a hill in France. And this hill in France actually offered a view of the Saar River from the Super Sixers' second campaign in the distance. And so on March 15th, 1945, despite nonstop going continuously, these soldiers decided to stop and take a break. And they held a memorial service for the brothers they had lost thus far. And I just think this is such an important moment to focus on, because in a time of pressure, the Super Sixers took the time to honor the men they had lost. And this perfectly demonstrates the connection through the unimaginable trials that had been endured. The Super Six had undergone continuous loss and simultaneous victories, but chose to honor the prior rather than celebrate the latter. And every inch the division had conquered was done through each soldier's ability, fortitude, and will. And the surviving Super Sixers remember the soldiers lost in battle for the remainder of their lives.
Wow. And that is really, really rare, because, again, we're talking about Mary Louise Roberts' book, is that the process of dealing with the war dead, British, American, everyone, was always very detached from the units themselves. It was all the graves registration units to handle it. It's all done away from yourself. You're just, as a soldier in a unit, your focus is on the battlehead, moving forward. There was really never much time allowed for reflection, for memorialization. We think of that very much as a post-war thing. Once the war's over, then you can think about the men you lost. But the fact that this unit are doing it when the war is still raging says something. I'm not quite sure what it says, but it's really interesting what it says. It's not something we consider very often, that the people stopping during combat for a real official recognition. I mean, obviously individuals are having those moments when they say goodbye to a comrade. We think of Band of Brothers and Garnier going off on the Joe Toy, going off on the Jeep, those kind of personal moments. But as an organized, semi-organized, unofficial event, we don't think of it very often. That's really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was quite shocked when I read that myself. I just think it really shows. I was shocked that they even took the moment in a time when they did not even give themselves a moment to breathe, really. I just think it shows how close these soldiers really were and how much they leaned on each other. And I think it really emphasizes how humble they were. They really didn't focus anything on the accomplishments of what the 6th Armored Division did. It was always the focus on the men that they had lost. I think it just really shows that, I've been saying, their combat ability may decrease over time, but that bond created continued to prosper under such attrition in the European theater. And I just thought it was so beautiful. So after they took this beautiful moment on March 15th, the 6th Armored Division finally punched through the Siegfried Line on March 20th and began to cross the Rhine River on March 25th into Germany. Thomas Hackler says that this was his favorite memory in the war, because here is when he got to watch the renowned General Patton take a moment to urinate into the river in, quote, an emulation of William the Conqueror, as he said. And he said it was just it was a moment of joy in such a tumultuous time. And also during this time, one of my favorite moments, I was talking about Gus Caceres and how he was saying that he felt so much more expendable than a tank during the Battle of the Bulge. Yep. It was also during this time, it's important to note that Gus was a first-generation Greek American. And once these soldiers were able to move northeast to capture Frankfurt, Germany, and establish a bridgehead, Gus Caceres says that his absolute favorite moment of war is when he was able to liberate Greek prisoners of war in Frankfurt and tell them in his native language, Greek, that they were free men. And he recalls it as one of the best moments of the war for him. And he admitted that he was grateful his parents made him go to Greek school so he didn't lose his native language.
Wow.
So he just stayed and celebrated with them. It was amazing to hear. And then, unfortunately, all the incredible moments of war were soon forgotten when the soldiers ran into Buchenwald concentration camp. So Buchenwald was liberated during the Germany campaign as the Super Six was trying to continue its drive into Germany. And it just so happened that on April 11th, 1945, the 6th Armored Division was in Weimar, Germany, which was just miles away from Buchenwald concentration camp. When they entered Weimar, a lot of the soldiers said that they were first met with a smell that was indescribable. Warren Priest, like many of the Super Sixers, never forgot the smell. As we'll soon go into, that stench was that of burning human bodies. And Warren recalls when he was in his 70s, he accidentally burnt his skin and had a burn. And he said that the smell of burning flesh sent him into a blackout state that he did not come out of for weeks. Wow. Truly, this scent was so heavily associated with everything. And anytime he smelled burning flesh, he was just brought back to Buchenwald. So, like many incidents of the war, the Super Six accidentally liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. And that is when they saw the horrors of Buchenwald. I would like to give a warning. I'm about to show some pretty graphic pictures of the liberation of the camp, but I just want to share that to be safe. So these are never before seen pictures taken of the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp. And I just really want to show that these men were incredibly used to war at this point. They had seen bodies, they had seen it more often than any of us ever have, and they were used to it, unfortunately. However, Buchenwald was a completely different experience for all of them. And I feel like any historian that really talks about the Holocaust or the concentration camps will touch on this. This was completely different. They had never seen just the destruction of humans through such a horrific experience. And for those that were alive, Thomas Hackler and any soldier really talks about them as the walking dead, that those who were still alive just looked like they should not have been. And it was just horrible. When they walked in, Thomas Hackler was met by a man who spoke English, and he was telling him about the games that the Nazi guards would play, one of which sticks with me, was they would throw the infant children and babies into the air of the prisoners and play a game of who can shoot the child down first. And Thomas Hackler just says he would have nightmares of these stories every day for the rest of his life. And he saw women that were hiding in the corner because they were undressed, just humiliated to be seen by the American soldiers. And so this was different for a lot of them. And this is really when the effects of the war culminated. A lot of the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division said that they blacked out after this moment, and the rest of the war was in a zombie-like daze. And then moving on to another picture. Here's another never-before-seen picture taken by one of the Super Sixers of the oven at the camp with a prisoner standing in front of it. And they truly, all of them hated this moment and did not talk about it. A lot of the children, I spoke mainly to the children of the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division, and a lot of them openly talk about that they would learn about World War II in class and ask their dads about it, and their dads would never give any details about their experiences or how they liberated a concentration camp themselves. So I just think that is incredibly important, and this is really the time when that bond was fortified of going through such a traumatic experience that us today will never really be able to.
And to kind of collectively close it off, everybody who saw it, all kind of without actually having any formal agreement, all agree, we'll just box that away, just put that in a part of our minds and somehow try and move on. Yeah, it's terrible stuff. And Yeah, well, one can only imagine what these guys went through.
Absolutely. And then so just moving on into that. So the culmination of the effects of the frontline combat and Buchenwald forced the men into silence for a lot of them. The memories and experiences of the soldiers were held captive in their minds. Some descendants believe that this was due to the cultural taboo of a veteran discussing their traumatic memories at war, while others believe their father or grandfather would remove a lid that they could never fully replace if they discussed World War II, especially Buchenwald. The soldiers of the 6th Armored Division had lost comrades, body parts, and parts of their minds when they returned from war. Here's William Luman. He's on the right, and his best friend Smitty is the one on the left, and Smitty was killed in war. William never spoke of Smitty again, and his son Bill predicts that he could not discuss his best friend because it was such a horrific loss for him. And here is Thomas Hackler. Like many of the soldiers, he suffered tremendously after the war from the back pain of the oven, the mental effects, and he really did begin a life when he returned from war of alcoholism and addiction, because he said that he never really, like when he went to the VA, they would give him treatments for his back, but they never talked to him about the mental effects of war that haunted him. And then finally, the significance of my research. I really want the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division to be remembered for both their sacrifices and their accomplishments during World War II. I firmly believe that their quiet and humble remembrance stripped them of the recognition that they had earned. I just really want to note that returning home was the mark of their longest campaign that they began, which was creating lives and legacies that their children and grandchildren could be proud to share. And I'm so honored that they did, because I was able to share their stories as a result. And with that being said, I just want to thank the incredible children and grandchildren of the Super Sixers for helping me with my research. I couldn't have done it without them. And then that is all.
I mean, amazing stuff. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. I've got a couple of things I want to kind of unpack with you, just the questions before we kind of end things off. One is right at the beginning, you were very quick to bring in PTSD, the shared experience. That's something that your age group would automatically look for that as being a part of this, because that you've grown up in an environment when it is completely open, everybody talks about it. People writing the histories back in the 50s and 60s, it just wasn't something they quite had a handle on. In the sense, they all knew that the concept existed. Everybody who served in World War II would have had experience with someone around them or themselves dealing with, there's all the different words we used back then of combat, shock and stress and this, that. But it's interesting that you were able to bring it in, completely identify it and say it's integral to what their experiences was. So that's more of a comment rather than a question. But thank you for that. And the second thing I think is more about the, I think you're the first person to ever really articulate the idea that it was the military themselves that began the alcohol thing. I think I had realized that without having anybody pointing it out to me. And obviously we've talked about it a lot, that people did cope. The coping mechanism for many of them was alcohol. But the fact that you're suggesting it was actually the army themselves, and you've had a long day, all off to the pub. I'd never quite articulated that. So did that come to you kind of instantly, that thought, or was that a process? I'm just really interested in how you came up with that.
I'm going to be honest. I think the veterans did a lot of the work for me. I had never even processed. I think like so many would just assume like, wow, I would want to drink as well after some day like that. But Thomas Hackler, especially his writing, he said that the United States Army, like they may not have what the veterans would have wanted to, but they always had beer and cigarettes and as much as they needed on deck for these soldiers at that point at all times. And I think that really led me to the conclusion of that was a priority for them, was making sure that these veterans had alcohol and had ways to cope that would actually get them through the experience.
Yeah, and I want to stress that I don't think anybody was doing anything in a bad way. We might now recognize that giving people who are mentally struggling alcohol is maybe not the best recipe, but we're not suggesting that the American Army, the British Army, were bad to have alcohol available. Just that we can now see that maybe it's kind of pouring fuel on fire there.
Absolutely. Gosh, no. I think a lot of it is just, like I was saying, ignorance. They didn't really know what these effects were. I think the most shocking thing to me about just how unknown mental issues were at that time was, I mentioned that William Lumen had gone away from war in December 1944 because he was struggling from battle fatigue. One thing I didn't even know about was that he had to go through insulin therapy while he was gone in between for a little bit of time in between the Battle of the Bulge. And that's when they put him in a temporary coma with insulin to treat his battle fatigue. And I just think that is something that I didn't even understand. I think that just really demonstrates that the United States Army, the British Army, were really trying to help their soldiers. They just really didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, it's not that they didn't recognize the problems. I mean, Jonathan Fennell, the Irish British historian, has done lots of work in the morale in the British Army, and the powers that be were recognizing that there were these problems, but so they didn't have the solution. They were doing what they thought was the right thing, but we could now say perhaps wasn't. Fascinating stuff. But my last question, really, you focused on the men of the 6th Armored being particularly from a rural background, Midwest, and that all ties in with the idea of the ability to repair Sherman tank engines and et cetera, et cetera. But do you think if there is a higher percentage of rural guys in the unit, that would hinder them after the war as well, in the fact that they perhaps were going back to farms and isolated, didn't maybe have the mechanism around them? Whereas if you're going back to a city and perhaps you can join a veterans association, the Brits who join the British Legion, you're meeting up with other people who are, maybe there's an environment where you kind of go, you know what, are you sleeping all right, Jim? No, I'm not sleeping very well. Whereas if you're going back to a farm and you've got a family and big families, do you think that contributed to the fact that they didn't really have that mechanism?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to be honest. I really think that there are positives and negatives in both. For a lot of these veterans, they did return home to their farm life. And I'm going to be honest. I think a lot of them really did well in returning back to this rural lifestyle. It really helped them get comfort, because a lot of these men, they have comfort in the fact of being in nature and working hard. That was really good for them. And I don't want to speak for any of these veterans, but I know for a fact that William Lumen, when he returned home from war, he went back to the city, actually. He was living in a big city. I think it was New York, I believe. But he suffered when he was in the city because of all the voices that were outside, and cars backfiring would immediately send him back into the war. And he actually moved his family into the absolute middle of nowhere in California as a result, because he just needed to get away from the big city. So I don't want to speak for any of the veterans.
I mean, obviously, we're talking about your country sent 16 million to war, and we sent 7 million from our countries. You can't speak for them, but I think another thing about the farming. I mean, my grandparents' generation on my mother's side is farming, and I think the farming folk I knew growing up, there's a very good sense of, after winter comes spring, after spring comes summer, kind of wait, because these things are phases. You're feeling bad now. A drought will be followed by rain again, and maybe there's that sort of sense of trusting the earth to bring things back to a harmony. Maybe I'm got people watching this going, Woody's off on one of his verbal thoughts. But I think there's something about good old farm folk that understand that you're part of a greater world that is moving with despite your own problems. Life will sort itself out. There is night will follow day, day will follow night, that kind of thing.
I could not agree more. And like I said, I was raised in a farming family. My dad's a farmer. And I just think I really connect with these soldiers of working on the farm is hard work, but you just feel at ease and you feel at peace. And it's an experience you can't really describe to those who have never experienced it. But I really think that if I had to say, I think that working on the farm was very beneficial for a lot of these men. It was peaceful. It was relaxing. Like you said, I feel like it put them back into the routine of the world and was very beneficial.
So my last question is where is this all going in terms of your career? I mean, is World War II going to be a big part of your future? Are you moving on to something else? What next? I mean, you've got theoretically a long career ahead of you.
Absolutely.
We talked earlier about the fact that the veterans are passing away. That era is going, and yet archives, things are being digitalized. So what's the future for you, do you think, at this point?
My dream is just to educate my generation and the younger generations about World War II. I mean, I'm a World War II historian. That's what I do. I'm getting my master's in war and military history. And my own best friends often forget what day D-Day happened on. It's very sad. I think we're just going into a time where World War II is being forgotten a little bit, especially those important details. And we promised our veterans we wouldn't forget. So I'm going to make sure that I keep my side of the promise.
Let's talk about Liberty Phillips and an amazing, Bridge to History project, where she's bringing kids back to Normandy. I mean, there are people doing things, and I'm not going to put you to the question of, how do we bring younger people in, because it's not a one sentence response. It is something collectively we have to work on. I know with this channel, according to my YouTube analytics, I have literally nobody in the 0 to 18 age group watching my channel. Literally nobody. 18 to 25 is like 2%. The great majority of my viewers are 50 and above. So, in a sense, we're preaching to the converted. The people watching me are the people who've grown up with World War II as part of their life. They've read the books, they've watched the films, but how we reach the younger people. Other channels are doing slightly different things, but it is a question that we struggle with, is how to bring people in. And I'm not going, maybe you have an instant solution right there, but it's complicated. I don't know what the answer is. What do you think the answer is?
I wish I knew. I'm going to be honest. I think right now, and this is what I've been telling people, I think right now getting my master's degree in World War II, I'm just really trying to give myself a leg to stand on in this historical world. And perhaps once I get my master's, my mission in life is going to be able to use my education and my age and the fact that I'm a woman to my advantage to be able to really try and figure out how to make World War II a subject that the Americans and the United States really know about and can remember for generations to come.
I think it's the themes. The war itself, if you're 15, can seem abstract. It's so far in the past. You haven't even got a great-great-grandparent that served if you're that age. But the themes of being scared, the themes of having to overcome trauma collectively, the themes of being scared collectively about problems in the world, they are universal. Unfortunately, my two stepdaughters, who are 25 and 21, they're facing globally the same kind of issues as the World War II generation did, but it's not through Spitfires and Mustangs and Sherman tanks. It's about the themes that I think will somehow, unfortunately, be universal, is that we can all identify with being scared and away from home and lonely, and that maybe is the inroad with people who are younger, is connect the themes first and then bring in all the dates and figures and FDR and Churchill and aircraft carriers later on, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I could not agree more. I just want to make sure that the ideas of World War II are never forgotten. Like, I know people who met World War I veterans, and that is a dream of mine, because me growing up, World War I felt so far away and this unknown subject. And I would just hate for that to happen to World War II as well, especially because I have been so honored to get to create personal bonds with 40 World War II veterans. And I promised them their stories would never be forgotten. So it's just really important to me that we do use those themes and figure out ways to preserve those stories for all time.
Yeah, well, we'll leave it there. And I'm glad we did a whole presentation about the 6th Army with barely mentioning tanks. That's the whole point. I mean, there's the YouTube is chock full of which is the best model of this, and why did they have this gun, and what would the Shermans do against Panthers, and how does it... But the people are the universal connecting subject, and I'm really glad that's what you focus on. So we'll end things there. So, folks, thank you for watching this, and please feel free to leave your comments, and I'm hoping we can address them together once it's been aired. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been an absolute honor.